Good evening, distinguished guests, speakers, panelists, my colleagues, our students, and the Albany University family. As the chair of the Criminal Justice Department, it's a very great pleasure for me to welcome you all at Albany University for our panel discussion on Not in Our City, Human Trafficking. Our panel is organized by the Albany State University Criminal Justice Department in collaboration with the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys and Lily Pad SANE Center. And the most important thing is that this is the week when the world is about to commemorate the International Women's Day, which is on March 8th. When we talk about human trafficking, we say that when we look at it, sometimes we call it a modern form of slavery. And today, we are very fortunate not only to have one of the world-leading experts on human trafficking as our guest speaker, but also a group of panelists who have extensive experience dealing with issues of human trafficking and sexual abuse. There are several million of people who are victims of human trafficking. And the United States, the state of Georgia, and the city of Albany are not immune from this scourge of modern slavery. The goal of our panel is to improve our understanding of the complexities of addressing human trafficking in the United States of Georgia and the city of Albany, such as we have to understand the societal risk factors that create the context in which human trafficking happens in the state of Georgia and the city of Albany in particular. We also have to discuss the existing services for victims and survivors of human trafficking in Georgia and the city of Albany. Exploring solutions or actions to increase the prevention, protection, and prosecution of acts of human trafficking in our city. We would like to extend our gratitude to all that have made this event possible. Particularly, we have to thank our Provost, Dr. Angela Peters, who initiated this event, and Dr. Liwanga, who assembled the panelists. We hope after this to establish a center for child protection and human rights at the Department of Criminal Justice to address child abuse issues, including child trafficking. We have capable professors to do that, and we have capable students to do that. Most of them are here, and I'm very proud of you all. I hope you all will enjoy the presentation and debate. Thank you, and have a pleasant evening. I'll now call on Dr. Liwanga to introduce the keynote speaker. Dr. Liwanga.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a great privilege for me to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Siddharth Kara, who is also a colleague and a friend. Professor Kara is globally recognized as one of the leading experts on the issue of human trafficking. Across 20 years of research, he has traveled to more than 50 countries to document cases of several thousand of all kinds of slavery. His book, Sex Trafficking Inside the Business of Modern Slavery, was named as co-winner of the prestigious Frederick Douglass Award at Yale University in 2010. That book was also adapted on as a Hollywood film. That film was titled Traffic. Professor Kara also published 2 more books, including Bandit Labor, Tackling the System of Slavery in South Asia, and The Modern Slavery, A Global Perspective. Currently, Professor Kara teaches a human trafficking course at Harvard Kennedy School. He is also advising the United Nations, the United States government, and other governments of foreign countries on issue of human trafficking, specifically policy and laws. He is a regular contributor at the CNN Freedom Project. Presently, he is devoting his research effort on the issue of child labor and forced labor in the cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In that context, Professor Kara is also part of an initiative that has recently filed a lawsuit against some of the giant tech, such as Apple, Google, Tesla, Microsoft, for benefiting from child labor, specifically in the mining industry in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, without further ado, please let us give a big round of applause to Professor Siddharth Kara.
Good evening. I want to thank first Dr. Peters and Dr. Liwanga for inviting me to speak to you this evening. And I certainly want to thank all of you for braving the dark and gloomy weather to come out and participate in this evening. Dr. Liwanga is a colleague and friend, as he mentioned. He's asked me to perform a small miracle tonight, which is to give you my knowledge on modern slavery in 20 minutes. So I'm going to speak as briskly but clearly as I can to give you sort of an overview on modern slavery, and then I'll very much look forward to our discussion. Now, to talk about modern slavery, the first thing that I say to people is we can't lose sight of the past, and we need to put the contemporary manifestation of slavery in some historical context in order to understand how it functions and works today. So I'm going to take you all on a short journey just to remind everyone of the general functioning of old world slavery, and then start to draw some contrast to give you a sense of how it continues to persist in the modern age. Now, this building looks relatively new. It's got this rusted roof here and some shutters and all, but it's a structure that's refurbished in a museum that sits on the site of one of the first slave trading outposts that was built on the West African coast. This is in a town called Dougherty in Nigeria, a couple of hours west of Lagos. I visited this spot about 10 years ago during the course of doing research on human trafficking in Nigeria, and at that point I was about halfway through what's now a two-decade journey of researching slavery and child labor around the world. And it was in this moment, only after 10 years, that I felt I finally understood what slavery really means, what it meant in the past and what it means today. And so I'm going to take you on this journey. I started here at this museum, this slave trading outpost that, and of course, the Europeans were fine record takers. And so we know that there are around 550,000 Africans passed through this building as they were sold off into slavery. But after they were sold and bartered for things like brass rods and gunpowder and rum, they were brought to these holding cells called barracoons. And this one was the biggest one. It was actually built in 1840. That slave trading outpost was built in 1510, believe it or not. This was a slave holding pens, very cramped quarters where after they were purchased, the slaves were held in these pens and they were branded with the initials of their owner, because they were all crammed in the same cell and had to be disaggregated at some later point when they were going to be loaded onto ships. But that didn't happen immediately. They may spend weeks and months crammed atop each other before they were finally loaded onto ships, which were just off the coast. So finally, when they were taken from these barracoons, they had to take a walk over to where the ship was. And there's a little sign that says, this is the route, the journey that the slaves would take to this unknown destination. And so they would walk from the barracoons, they were shackled, taken over to the beach, and of course they had no clue, no sense or no idea of where they were going and what was in store for them. Some had just been rudely snatched away from their home villages, which could have been 100 or 200 or 300 miles from the coast. Many had never even seen the ocean before. So they were taken on this walk, and I walked on this walk. It's about a kilometer or so in distance across the grass and the sand. And then they were brought to a well. And this is where I finally understood what slavery really meant and means today. Each one of them, when they came to this well, was told they have to drink from the well and then recite a pledge, an oath. And the contents of that oath were basically that they agree to not revolt, they agree to be a slave, they understand that they will never return, and they pledge or agree to leave their soul behind. And they had to drink this water and recite this oath. Now put your mind in that person for just a moment and understand the gravity and the intensity of what was happening at that point, where you have to basically leave your soul behind, leave your home behind, leave your family behind, and agree that you'd be a slave without really even necessarily understanding what that meant and where you were even going. After this point, they were, of course, loaded onto ships, taken across the Atlantic. It usually took around 6-7 weeks to get across. And then there was a seasoning period of around a year before the slaves were really given hard labor. They were given about a year or so to make sure they survived. Around 50% of the people, from the point they were taken to the point that they may survive the seasoning period, as it was called, around 50% died. So if there were 3 or 4 or 5 million slaves who survived the Atlantic crossing and entered into slavery just in North America, not even across all of the Americas, that meant double that number were originally taken. A mass carnage of human life. So this is the moment where I understood what slavery really meant. The moment when they had to take this oath. It's an institution that systematically destroys everything that makes us human in order to create a compliant and servile laborer. It's essentially erasing our humanity, and it functions the same way today as it did throughout history, but there are some very important differences about slavery today versus the old world slavery that we tend to be more familiar with, and that's what I want to focus on now that we've sort of walked on that journey, that horrific, soul-destroying journey of the old world slave, to understand how does it work today? How can it even conceivably manifest and function in some similar fashion in the modern world? This is a table I've taken from my third book, where I've gotten a lot of data across the years and tried to draw a comparison of this old world slavery journey that I took you on just now and how it works today. And I think if you remember nothing else that I say this evening, try to remember this table, because I think it will give you an immediate insight into what modern slavery is versus old world slavery. So obviously in the old world, the journey of acquiring and moving and exploiting a person was long and expensive. And today it's relatively short or inexpensive. You can take someone from one side of the planet to another in a day or two if you really put your mind to it. In the old world, there was only a few sectors of exploitation, primarily agriculture, of course, domestic work, constructions. The slaves had trades like blacksmith and so forth. But today there are dozens of sectors in which individuals are exploited in slave-like conditions, manufacturing, agriculture, of course, but commercial sex and many others. The cost of a slave is where things get quite interesting, because this speaks to the economic transition of Old to New World slavery. So in the Old World, a couple of centuries ago, if you sampled data all around the world, roughly the average cost of a slave in today's dollars would be around $5,000. That price has dropped 90% in 2 centuries. A big part of that is the speed of transportation. Correspondingly, the return on investment for the person who bought and exploited a slave has skyrocketed. In the Old World, it may have been 15 or 20% return on investment per year. Now it's 300, 400, 500% per year. In several commercial sectors, it can exceed 1,000% per year. So the economics are where slavery has radically transformed from Old World to New World. It's quicker, easier, and cheaper to get a slave, and you can generate much more money per slave than you could in the past more quickly. This, of course, meant that in the Old World, you would typically exploit a slave for the duration of their lifetime and then their children and so forth, whereas now it could be a few months, it could be a few years, or even less. In some sense, human life has become a little bit more disposable as you acquire, exploit, and jettison the slave and then find a new one. Now, the last one is the interesting point, which is for most of human history, you could legally own another person, like property. That's what being a slave meant, chattel slave, property. Now, you can't do that anymore. That's what the whole wave of slavery abolition beginning in the late 1700s and into the 1800s and 1865 in this country and on, that's what that accomplished. You can't legally own anyone. But then what are we talking about modern slavery and human trafficking if you can't actually own and exploit a slave? So already we've talked about several terms, and I just from an academic standpoint want to get clear on them, because I'll then answer this question of, well, what do you mean by modern slavery if you can't really own people anymore? There are these terms, slavery, forced labor, human trafficking. They tend to be a little confusing and sometimes interchangeable, and that has been an issue in trying to address contemporary forms of slavery. Slavery, to give you the first international definition, was set down in a 1926 League of Nations Slavery Convention. It basically means treating someone like property, exerting power over them as if you own them. You can do what you want to them. And that's been the definition of slavery throughout history. Modern slavery is then what? You can't own people anymore. You can't exert power over a person whom you officially own. So what does it mean? Well, in essence, it's come to mean treating someone as if you own them. You may not have a piece of paper that says you own them, but they are of some condition by virtue of poverty, gender, or ethnic identity, virtually powerless, and so you can exert and control them as if they're property. And in a way, that's how slavery has evolved and continued to persist. Well, just because you wrote on a piece of paper, I can't own someone like property, doesn't mean I can't stop treating them that way. And that's what modern slavery or modern day slavery has come to mean. But then there's this other term people threw into the mix, forced labor. Some people said, no, look, slavery is slavery. We know what it is. It's what happened in Dougherty. It's what happened to those millions of people. And all the blood that was shed, all the lives that were lost, all the exploitation that took place, that's a specific historical thing. And that term should really only apply to that phenomenon. So let's have another term, and that's called forced labor. So just 4 years after slavery was first defined in international law, this International Labor Organization definition of forced labor was set down. And it essentially means coercing labor from a person that's not offering it voluntarily. Well, what do these terms mean? As you probably study here in your criminal justice program, definitions of crimes can use a lot of words, but they don't always necessarily tell you what those words mean. And then people have to sit and think, well, what do these words mean? And we have to use a law suit to test a potential definition and create a definition. So it centers largely around a person not voluntarily doing work and being coerced to do work. And I've given some examples of how we identify those conditions and then may determine that this is a case of forced labor. And then finally, this other term that we've been talking about today, human trafficking. 7 decades later, in the year 2000, in another UN convention, this concept of human trafficking was set down in international law. And I haven't put the definition here because it's like a paragraph long and it's tedious to read, but in essence, it has three elements. That you recruit, harbor, or obtain someone through force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of exploiting them in slave-like conditions, debt bondage, sexual slavery, involuntary servitude, etc. So as you can see now, there's already a lot of overlap and potential confusion between these three terms, and that's something that we tussle and wrestle with in the field of human trafficking and modern slavery, because depending on what term you use, how do you identify someone, and certainly how do you prosecute a case? By relying on a certain definition. And if there's confusion between them and even competition between them, that can create efforts. Complication in our efforts. What's the scale of all of this that we're talking about? Estimates range of 30 to 40 million people as slaves in the world today, generating profits that exceed $150 billion. And there's a huge variance by type of slavery in the profits generated. An agricultural slave in South Asia may generate a few $100s in profits per year for their exploiter, but a sex trafficking victim somewhere in the West, in the UK or France or US, could generate $150,000 or more in profit per person per year. So you can quickly see how the numbers get to these staggering economic benefits associated with exploiting someone like they're a slave. I want to give you a few examples now. That's a lot of words and definitions, but what does it really look like? What are some of the manifestations of slavery? This is an example of child sex trafficking. This is a massage parlor in Thailand, a very common phenomenon, and many tourists go to Thailand in search of one thing and one thing only. The bottom level, it'll look pretty normal. There are some adult females here waiting to see if you'd like a foot massage and so forth. And then there's the owner of the place, the proprietor, over at this door back there. And when I came in as a single male tourist, the offer immediately was, well, come up here and let me show you what else we have. And she took me up there, down a hall, opened a door, and there were about a dozen 10, 11, 12-year-old girls. And they were told to take off their robes, and I would pick one for $5 for an hour. $5. That's how cheap a child can be. And needless to say, it was a painful moment, of which I've had many in my research. I couldn't even begin to talk or bargain with her or try to speak and understand the economics of what she was doing or where were these people from. I just had to walk out and leave. And as I was walking out, this is when I got this shot. She said, okay, she 2 for 1. Because I wasn't making a transaction with her, so 2 for 1. And then I said, no, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to take this picture and memorialize this moment and talk about it with people around the world so they understand. And those young girls were from a minority hill tribe. They were often not registered at birth. They're invisible. They're poor. And they're sent here. And many Western men do purchase them for $5 for the hour. A little bit more on children. Children are often sent into forced begging. You may travel around the world, see poor children forced to beg to make money, and oftentimes it's not for them or their families, it's for some human trafficking ring that has abducted these children and taken them and put them on the street to force them to beg. Now this was in Tirana, the capital of Albania, across the street from the U.S. Embassy in Albania. These children are Roma. For those of you who are not familiar, they are an outcast group of poor nomads. Sometimes they're derogatorily called gypsies, but they come from the Middle East and South Asia, and they've migrated to Europe centuries ago, and they live on the fringes of cities as sort of in these poor enclaves as nomads, and they're seen as filthy, subhuman people. They're darker skinned than the average white-skinned European in these cities. So these children are easy pickings for human trafficking rings that just pick them up and put them on the street and to help them generate more money, they'll often injure the child. So the child lying down was actually unconscious. They had cut his forehead, it was bleeding, and that means that the U.S. Embassy personnel, and there's all these embassies around there, which is why they place the children there, may throw a few coins out of pity or mercy, all of which is going to go to the human trafficking ring. So very little cost to them to grab these sort of nomadic, disenfranchised poor kids, throw them on the street, cut them and so forth, and let the money start to accumulate. This is me with an NGO colleague and 2 South Asians. These are Bangladeshi men, and we're in Singapore. They had been recruited with the promise of a high-wage construction job in Singapore, earning money that they wouldn't earn in 10 years. And all their paperwork is arranged in exchange for an upfront debt. We'll get you there, we'll get you the job, we'll give you the paperwork and all the permits, but you owe us about $10,000, and you have to work it off once you get there. So what do you think happens to these people? They're given the job, they work far in excess of that upfront debt. They're told, oh, now there's the fee of where you live, and then your food, and there's this new health check, and all of this, and before they know it, these debts have become something so extravagant that they'll never repay them. They're worked to the bone for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, ultimately paid next to nothing, and then just sent on their way. And these 2 gentlemen had found their way to an NGO that was trying to help them, but it's a common ruse used in the construction sector and the domestic worker sector in many countries to get cheap to free labor. Much of the East Asia and certainly the Middle East is being built on the backs of duped, trafficked, poor South Asians and East Asians. These 2 boys are in a tea plantation in Bengal. This is actually an original plantation built by the British when they had South Asia as a colony. Some of the same equipment is still in there 160 plus years later. And what's remarkable about this image, these individuals belong to an outcast, darker-skinned group of people who trace their ancestry back to the original time when the British trafficked all these poor peasants into their tea plantations. This tea plantation exports to the West. If you drink tea, you will be drinking this tea often. They're worked around the clock. They grab about an hour of sleep on top of tea leaves now and again every few days. And this is why tea can be so cheap. They are the 5th and 6th generation descendants of slaves still working in slave-like conditions because of their caste identity and the fact that no one really cares about them. So these legacies of exploitation persist on and on and on, and in the modern context, get exported right to our teacups. And I'll come back to that in just a moment, because modern slavery, in being so profitable, has become a big global business. Here's another big global slavery business, seafood. I've spent quite a bit of time in Thailand. Of course, you saw the sex trafficking image first. Well, many men and boys are trafficked from surrounding regions into Thailand, into the seafood sector. Thailand has the 2nd largest seafood sector in the world, and they are the largest shrimp exporting country. Anyone ever been to an all-you-can-eat shrimp buffet for $10? That's why it's $10. Because those men are put on those ships, they spend 1 or 2 years at sea, and then many of them are just shot and thrown overboard. And that's how shrimp has become so cheap. And other seafood as well has become so cheap. The US is the largest importer of Thai shrimp. So I've documented, and I write about this, these men who are, again, given these job opportunities. There's these upfront debts. You're going to see this repeated again and again in the modern slavery world. And they have all these promises. They go out on these ships, and I've told you what often happens to them. Those that survive and come back, some of whom I interviewed, then work on the docks. They probably suffered an injury or something, so they can't go out to ship anymore, out to sea anymore. But this has led to a catastrophic exploitation of poor men from Burma, Cambodia, Laos, all surrounding Thailand. And we feed that with our desire for cheap stuff, whether it's tea, clothes, or seafood. And then closer to home, agriculture. Slaves were originally brought to this country for agriculture. And it might shock, surprise, and enrage you to know that there are still slaves in the American agricultural system. This is a shot I took in the Central Valley of California, where I documented hundreds and hundreds of individuals in slave-like conditions. Some of them were brought on guest worker visas, and then documents are confiscated and they're kept on with the threat of deportation, the promise of some future wage, upfront debts, again used to recruit them. And then many of them are irregular migrants. They make their way across, they're looking for an opportunity, and that irregular migration status is then used as a threat. Well, I'll take you to the police if you don't like what's happening here. And you can imagine the kinds of conditions. This is a boy, he's got pesticides all over him, he's going to be sick. This is his older sister, same thing. They're trying to protect themselves, you can see that. But they're breathing in harsh pesticides all day, they're worked to the bone, they're paid very little, and it's because we need cheap stuff. I'm not ascribing the blame to us, but we all want cheaper things, and companies know that, and they know there's one segment in the slave, in their model, which I'm going to come to, that they can press down, and that's labor costs. So they look for cheap, poor, vulnerable labor, including in the American agriculture system. So that's the business. That's the business of modern slavery. How do we understand a business through supply and demand? I'm going to do this very quickly because I know I've probably already gone over my time. But what are the forces that feed the supply of potential slaves? It's poverty. I think that's obvious right now. It's economic disenfranchisement, social instability, corruption, lawlessness, all these things, and particular bias against certain ethnic communities and female gender that make people vulnerable, poor, dispossessed, disenfranchised, and more susceptible to being recruited or just outright exploited. The demand side is what's different. This comes back to that table I showed you, old world versus new world. There is always, in the slave business chain today, the exploiter's demand for more profit and our demand for cheaper stuff. What does that mean? Throughout history, for almost every business, labor is the highest cost component. As a result, producers have tried to find ways of minimizing labor costs, and of course, slavery is the extreme. Let's just about eliminate labor costs. When you reduce labor cost, the cost of your business are substantially reduced, which allows you to do two things. Number one, you can lower the cost of what you're selling to become more price competitive, and that, of course, then drives consumer demand. And that element is the main difference between old and new world slavery, the globalization of competition, because now companies don't just compete with the company next door to them, but with everyone all over the world, which is why they're sourcing out, looking for cheap labor markets, under-regulated labor markets, suppressed labor, so that they can cut costs and then boost their shareholder value and profits, and then also be competitive in selling us cheaper stuff. And that vicious cycle keeps repeating itself, and those suffering the worst of it are the poor, oppressed, exploited individuals in slave-like conditions. So that means slavery has evolved from the old world to the new world as a way in which the unscrupulous producer will try to advance profits and maximize price competitiveness by looking for that cheap, expendable, disposable human being that they can exploit like a slave, jettison, and then go find the next one for cheap. That gives us a central thesis on modern slavery. I gave you that definition of slavery as property. In my experience, modern slavery constitutes a violent and coercive transformation of the suffering of a global subclass of humanity into the delightful things we consume every day, the cup of tea, the shirt, the chocolate bar, the food, and so forth. Which brings me to the last slide, which is the subject of my work in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Liwanga. And I'll just leave you with this image and a brief explanation of what it is, and then I think we'll have, I hope, an energetic conversation. I took this picture a couple of years ago in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'm sure Dr. Liwanga has talked to you all about what's happening in the southeastern corner of that country. These children, you see, there are clearly children here, and these young men are digging for cobalt containing stones called heterogenite. 70%, almost 70% of the world's supply of cobalt is found in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. About a third of that, by my estimation, is coming from sources like this, children and poor peasants. And every single smartphone, tablet, laptop, and electric vehicle on the planet recharges only with cobalt in the battery. So that means those children, that poverty, that suffering, that toxicity, and that misery is what we use to check social media, check email, send messages, and if we're lucky, drive around town. And the companies that are selling us these gadgets for obscene amounts of money are making profits hand over fist and sharing next to nothing with these people because they're perceived as disposable, impoverished, poor, expendable, and no one's going to stand up and fight for them. Well, little did they know that Dr. Liwanga and I were going to do just that with some of our colleagues and some of our friends on the ground, primarily his colleagues that he's introduced me to, and that's our current effort. The last thing I'll say is cobalt is toxic. And you don't see any masks or gloves or of any kind. So these people are being poisoned to death every day. It gets out into the earth and the water. So even if you're not in cobalt mining, if you live in this part of the country, you're being poisoned every day by our gadgets, our gadgetry, our shiny, flashy devices. And the deeper, the boys and men dig tunnels to get deeper deposits. There are more pure cobalt deposits deeper down. They can dig 80 or 90 feet deep. I think there are thousands upon thousands of tunnels in this part of the Congo, and I'm willing to wager anyone that at least one collapses per week. And when they do, they bury alive everyone inside, boys and young men, 30, 40, 50, 60. When Dr. Liwanga and I were last in the Congo, just back in September, we were near an area called Lake Malo, and a tunnel had collapsed some hours before we were there, the previous night. And when we went to the site, we learned that there were 63 boys and men down, and all 63 had been buried alive. Not one of them survived. So that's the human cost of our daily lives, and that's the human cost at the other end of companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, that are worth trillions of dollars collectively, and these people eke out this poisoned, horrific existence on maybe $1 or $2 of income per day. And that, for me, is the clearest manifestation of what modern slavery has come to be. So, thank you.
I'm Angela Peters, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Albany State. I'd like to introduce you to the panel, and then each one of the panelists will give you a brief introductions about various areas in which they're involved. Honorable Gregory Edwards is the District Attorney for the Dougherty Judicial Circuit, and he is also an alum of Albany State. He will talk to you about the prosecution aspect of human trafficking. And then we have Ms. Mary Martinez, and she is the Executive Director of the Lily Pad SANE Center. She's a graduate of Georgia Southwestern State University, and she will talk to us about the protection and services that are available for victims. And you've heard our speaker. And then we have Dr. Roger-Claude Liwanga, and he is an Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice here at Albany State, and he is the person who actually coordinated this event. Thank you, sir. He and his criminal justice colleagues who are here. Thank you. And he will talk to us about the awareness of human trafficking here in college. Honorable Edwards.
Good evening, everyone. And what I wanted to add to this discussion is, of course, my role in terms of a prosecutor. What we're looking at here in Georgia, and perhaps in Albany, is the notion that the primary exploitation of humans has been with sex. And so child sexual exploitation is what I have been focusing on in my prosecutions and in investigations that have occurred here in this area. And unfortunately, Georgia, because of the international airport in Atlanta, is one of the hubs of this nation as far as this type of activity. And so There's kind of a trickle-down effect for the rest of the state. Albany has its issues because, again, we're sort of a hub for this geographic area. We don't have a lot of agriculture in Dougherty County per se, but some of the bedroom communities or counties are heavily engaged in agriculture. And so we have a lot of migrant workers that come through this area. We have a lot of migrant workers that are housed in this area. So there may be the potential that has been described in the presentation of this type of exploitation. But fundamentally, when we're talking about child exploitation, what we're looking at is a child who has received food, drugs, money, or shelter in exchange for sex. And this is the issue that is most, critical to what's going on in this area. And Georgia has enacted a lot of legislation that will help us with prosecuting these types of cases, giving us stronger penalties for prosecuting pimps, the persons that exploit our children. But one of the things that is critical to all of this is that my belief about the criminal justice system is it has three prongs: prevention, intervention, and restoration. Now, restoration is what happens after a person is convicted of a crime. Prevention or intervention is where we deal with the offenders, but it is prevention which is most critical to this situation. We need to stop the supply of victims that are being exploited and used in various ways. So there's a lot to that, and what I have always stressed is getting out the information that is needed to help prevent our young people, male and female, from becoming victims, becoming exploited in child sexual exploitation schemes. There's a lot. I think what I can best do is answer questions as you all have as you present them, and so I'm going to pass on to the next presenter.
Good evening, Mary Martinez-Allen from the Lily Pad. If you're not familiar with who we are or what we do, we are your local rape crisis and children's advocacy center. What we do at Lily Pad is, whether it is an adult or a child, male, female, you can come into our doors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We offer forensic medical examinations and forensic interviews, as well as court-appointed special advocates for children in foster care. What we are trying to do to combat human trafficking is A, educate our multidisciplinary team members, our law enforcement, our DFACS workers, our therapists, our school employees on how to recognize when someone is a victim, because they don't always self-identify. And also being the most credible SANE Center where we are able to collect forensic evidence that our prosecution needs. One of the most important things we're doing right now is in every judicial circuit, a sexual assault response team is required. Participation is required by law enforcement, the district attorney's office. There's a mental health component. There is a sexual assault nurse examiner component. It's everyone that works these cases. It gives them the opportunity to staff each and every case to find out what is the best way to help this victim and to also aid in prosecution. And what Dougherty County is doing, sorry, I'll borrow this. What Dougherty County is doing on the forefront is we're developing a human trafficking task force to better combat this problem here locally. So I do think that we're on the forefront of doing this, and I'm grateful for that. One thing that was not mentioned that I think is important to mention is when you come in contact with someone that may be a trafficking victim is to remember what is called Stockholm Syndrome. A lot of victims, again, don't self-identify. They don't understand that they are a victim. They may love their trafficker. Their trafficker provides them with their basic needs. It's no different than the general public being confused about, well, why does this 5-year-old still love or care about their mom or their dad when they're beating them? That's not uncommon, that's normal. They're provided food, clothing, shelter. They're provided and afforded their basic needs. And so are trafficking victims. It is not easy to say, well, you know what, I'm just gonna leave tonight because I'm being abused, when the punishment is you're beaten severely, you're raped again, your kneecaps are broken, you're told you're worthless. You know, you could be killed if you leave. It's detrimental. And so I did want to mention that because I think that's one of those biggest misconceptions that we don't always understand, or it's hard for us to understand, is that Stockholm Syndrome. But again, here in Dougherty County, we are combating this head on, and I think that we have taken the necessary steps to identify victims and to then be able to prosecute those cases appropriately.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Liwanga. I think most of you know me. For me, it is a privilege to share this podium with this experienced panelists to discuss the issue of human trafficking. Because most of the previous speakers cover almost all the aspects of human trafficking, I'll be focusing my presentation on addressing the following question. What is the level of awareness of Albany State University students on the issue of human trafficking? When we are in the process of organizing this panel discussion, many colleague professors and students here at Albany State University, as well as some friends outside of the university, were repeatedly asking me the same question. Is the city of Albany affected by the issue of human trafficking? Of course, I was not surprised by that question, because some cases of human trafficking in Albany, as in many cities, are underreported. For instance, currently, there is minimal data available concerning labor trafficking in the state of Georgia. And the lack of reporting about human trafficking can also lead some local authorities or the public to deny the existence of human trafficking in the community. Therefore, at the Criminal Justice Department, we designed a pilot, anonymous and classroom-based questionnaire to assess our students' familiarity with the issue of human trafficking. 50 students completed the questionnaire in February 2020, and those students were principally from the College of Professional Study, particularly Criminal Justice and the Business and Management Department. The questionnaire sought information on students' self-perceived awareness of human trafficking. Some of the questions that students were asked to respond, including their general knowledge of human trafficking. On that question, 90% of the participants reported that they were generally aware of human trafficking, 6% were uncertain, and 4% were not aware of human trafficking. They didn't have any knowledge of human trafficking. Another question was concerning the knowledge of different forms of human trafficking. 60% of students who participated reported that they were knowledgeable of the different forms of human trafficking. 36% were uncertain, and 4% were not knowledgeable. When they were asked about their knowledge concerning the difference between sex trafficking and human trafficking, 56% reported they were knowledgeable, 22% were uncertain, and 12% were not knowledgeable. Another important question was also the method of those students how did they become knowledgeable of human trafficking or sex trafficking. 6% of the participants reported that they became aware of sex trafficking because a friend or a family member was a victim of human trafficking. 74% they learned about human trafficking on social media, 14% by reading book, and 4% through discussion in the classroom. The last question was asked if they were aware that some commodity sold in the United States, such as clothes, food, or electronic devices, were produced by victims of labor trafficking abroad, specifically at the early stage of the supply chain. And 62% of participants reported that they were aware, 22% were unaware, and 60% were not aware of that issue. In conclusion, we can say that numerous students at Albany State University have limited familiarity with the issue of human trafficking. And most of them became aware of that issue through social media. And this pilot assessment of student awareness is very relevant to Albany State University faculty and leadership, to the way that it will be informing us how to develop some educational program on human trafficking in our university. Of course, we cannot fight the problem of human trafficking in our community while being blindfolded. Therefore, it is important to raise awareness about this issue. For instance, organizing a campaign or panel discussion, developing some educational program, and more importantly, collecting some data in order to assess what is the real scale of the problem of human trafficking in our community, because we cannot address an issue if we don't know the real scale of that problem. Therefore, it is important for scholar, academic, to develop some research project in order to understand what is the real scope of human trafficking in our community. Okay, thank you. That was all.
So we'll see who your favorite instructor is, huh? All right. I want to thank the panelists. At this time, we are going to open it up for questions from the audience. We have students in the audience. We have guests from the community. We have faculty, staff. We would like to open it up for questions at this time. Students, I'm sure you have lots of questions.
I just want to know what we're going to do to stop it. Like, do y'all have anything in place? Like, okay, people getting killed, like 62 people that were buried alive. What is anybody doing to stop it? Is my question.
You understand our question?
Yes.
Is this human trafficking?
Is this working?
She
Yes.
has particular emphasis on what is happening in the Republic of the Congo. What do we do to stop it?
Sure. Well, the immediate answer to your question is that Dr. Liwanga and I have initiated a lawsuit against major tech companies in order to hold them accountable for the harm, injury, suffering, and death of the poor people, women, men, and children of the Congo mining that cobalt. So that's the immediate answer to your question of what we're going to do about it. More broadly, what are we doing about human trafficking to hold perpetrators accountable? Well, I mean, everyone on this panel is doing something. I'm sure Honorable Edwards can talk about what he's doing to prosecute trafficking offenders, to hold them accountable, to create sort of a deterrent regime of justice, to dissuade other traffickers from committing that offense. And, you know, Ms. Martinez, the work they do with empowering and protecting survivors is crucial in efforts to address human trafficking, because Mr. Edwards won't have a witness if Ms. Martinez isn't first protecting and empowering them and caring for them. So all of these pieces work together to not just prevent the offense, but then to create a system within society whereby survivors have a place to go, can be protected, be empowered, as well as their family members who may face threats, and then the justice system, which will hopefully find a way of working with Ms. Martinez's survivors to bring a claim on their behalf from the state against the trafficker and hold them accountable in a serious and hopefully very punitive way. But I would then turn to you to talk more about what's being done here to hold people accountable.
Well, I'll just go ahead and supplement your response to this extent. Again, there are efforts in the state of Georgia in particular, like I said, to make punishment of offenders who are involved, particularly with child sex trafficking, held accountable, additional punishments, enhanced punishments. We have statutes that have expanded my authority to bring cases, different charges that would have otherwise been available are now available. But again, it is a whole system working together. The whole sex trafficking issue is, as you can see, very broad and international. So we have to coordinate all of the efforts of the local authorities, federal authorities, and international authorities to prosecute and bring persons to justice who have been involved with these issues. So it is a big issue. We have to look at the new means by which people are being exploited. We now have the communication and the exploitation of the internet to bring people together that are, trying to exploit others. So it is a very comprehensive effort that is being made by all of the persons that are involved with addressing this issue. But it does start fundamentally with individuals like yourselves helping to recognize and report these issues. Primarily, we're talking about we're talking about people your age. Generally, we're talking people in undergraduate studies, your age group. It is likely that somebody that you might have known back home is probably going to be put into that route. And helping to recognize and reporting and supporting those persons is one of the things that education of you all is what can best help prevent certainly some of the things that are going on here in the United States, and again, the coordinated effort to deal with issues that are international. So it's a very broad question, but the bottom line is that we're all working, but I think that what we can make the best progress in helping our nation, our community, is making you all aware of what to look for. And actually that's probably that's another session, which we are not constrained by time to get you that kind of information. But that's what we want to think. I think that's one of the best ways for us to help work on this issue.
So just to add to that, one of the things also that we're doing in our community is not only are all of those medical needs taken care of when we receive victims that have been trafficked, there's no cost. Every forensic examination initially is free. Any post-examination is free. If someone ends up needing something such as therapy or extensive medical treatment or anything of like that, then we can help them with victims' compensation too. So that financial burden is not a burden for the victim. And also, just to piggyback off of what you just said about reporting, that's the biggest thing when you're young and you're maybe questioning if you have a support system at home or not, and maybe you were in the wrong place at the wrong time or with people that you shouldn't have been around. None of those things matter. None of your past sexual history matters. I don't care if you were standing there naked and you had drank a bottle of vodka. That does not mean anyone has the right to touch your body. None of those things matter. There is something called a Victim's Bill of Rights. You cannot be asked to take a lie detector test. Your past sexual history cannot be brought up. And those are all things that our agency helps victims with and to understand when it comes to reporting. Trust and believe, I understand that reporting is extremely hard to do, especially in situations like that, where someone may, have been branded, someone has been trafficked. It's not prostitution, you are a victim of trafficking. And recently a bill was just passed where those charges can actually be expunged as well. So most importantly to take home, if you see something, say something. And if you know someone is a victim, please send them to us. We will be we'll be more than happy to help them report. If our district attorney doesn't know about it, he can't prosecute it.
And the main thing is recognizing exploitation and how tactics are used by individuals to exploit others. And it would be, the thing to do and educate yourself so that you can help fight the problem. It's really a grassroots effort to combat sexual trafficking, human trafficking, because again, we need the witnesses that will bring the information to give support to victims so that they can come forward. And when we have that, we can make direct attacks on these individuals that will be, trying to do this.
I just want to ask, I heard he's talking about Congo. I just want to ask, is there any other African countries that this trafficking is going on that we should know about? And what are the things we should look for to identify that somebody is being trafficked?
Thank you for your question. I think the issue of human trafficking or child trafficking or for labor exploitation is not unique to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in the Congo, for instance, as Professor Kara explained, most children are being exploited in the mining industry because the Democratic Republic of Congo is a naturally rich country with many natural resources, including cobalt, coltan, gold, diamond, and so on. And so it is most children are being exploited in that mining industry. But in Congo Brazzaville, for instance, which is a neighboring country to DRC, children are also exploited in the fishing industry. If you go to Côte d'Ivoire, children are being exploited in the cocoa industry. That means that some of Côte d'Ivoire is, for instance, one of the biggest producers of cocoa. And some of the chocolate that we are eating here in America are made with cocoa coming from Côte d'Ivoire. And children in Côte d'Ivoire are being exploited in the cocoa farm. The same thing in Ghana. So, how to address that issue?
Seem to be working.
Sorry. How to address that issue? That raises the question as to what are the causes of human trafficking. Among the causes, there is the issue of poverty. So, that means that human traffickers are taking advantage of the victim poverty. So to resolve the issue of human trafficking, you have to fight poverty. That means that it is the obligation of the government of those countries to try, to some extent, to reduce poverty in the country. That means that to fight unemployment of adults, also to build school for children in order to attend. Because in some countries, the local laws may say that education is free, but on the ground, education is not free, and children are forced to go to work because of lack of alternative. And in the case that we brought against some of the tech giants in America, most of our victims were not attending school. So that means that the human traffickers were exploiting them because of their poverty and their lack of alternative. So that is an issue that we need to address. And another component, as Honorable Edward covered, is the issue of prosecution. In most of the countries, laws prohibiting human trafficking or child labor exist, but they are not implemented. So now it is important to implement those laws, to enforce those laws, and to prosecute those who are benefiting either directly or indirectly from that. But to some extent, us, as a consumer of some of the product, we also have a responsibility. We have to inform the manufacturers of electronic devices to make sure that not to use products coming from child labor in the fabrication of the devices. Those who make chocolate, we have to inform them they should not use chocolate coming from cocoa produced by forced child labor. So these are, I think, responsibility are shared. The government, the exploiter, and us as a consumer, we also have responsibility about that. I don't know if you can comment.
Okay.
Yes, if I may add, I think it's very profound that our presenter pointed out how we as consumers are probably driving a lot of these issues. You know, we like our cheap shrimp, we like our tea, we like our cell phones, and we are driving these issues by, you know, wanting the things that are presented with these technologies and with these comforts. So it will be somewhat of an issue for each of us morally, I think about these things as you consider, you know, the consumer usage of things that are causing the exploitation of people. And so that's a moral issue, much larger than, you know, we can really get into with everything that is involved with this situation. But certainly that's one thing that you as individuals have to think about as a driver of these issues.
My name is Gregory Elder. I serve as the Chief of Police here at Albany State University. Dr. Peters, thank you for your moderation, and all of the panelists, thank you for the education you're giving us. This is a part of how we help the problem, you being here, so I appreciate you. As I serve in law enforcement, we're met with challenges of getting reports for specifically the sex trafficking and the sexual assaults. I would like a panelist to give us some pros and cons on a more granular level that relates to the students regarding the sex trafficking. And I want to frame that question by saying that the report that we get is very important. As some of the panelists know, that initial report is very important. And could someone explain how critical it is to get the right report to a responsible person like a police department or an agency so that it can be investigated properly versus sending a social media post? And I'm gonna give an example, not to cause any reaction, but to get down to where they may have caught some focus about this very recently, the white van. So if we could get kind of granular there to try to explain how really critical it changed the circumstances for the law enforcement officers who have to then go follow that up before it even gets to this level, and how it may interfere with what we can do, if you could expound on that.
Well, I'll take my best shot, Chief.
Okay. I have follow-up.
And one of the things that again is important is that if you see someone that appears to be involved in being victimized, one of the things that can happen is that support systems such as the support systems that Ms. Martinez has available will be one of the first things that can be implemented. And getting that victim to a place where they are comfortable with providing information, again, as noted, victims become reliant upon their pimps for support, for guidance, and they become totally loyal to them. and it's very difficult to get them. They've already been given pre-prepped responses to law enforcement about what they should say when they're asked questions about their relationships with persons. They've already been programmed, and it's continually programmed into them how they're going to respond to contact by law enforcement. But it's important, again, that you get that process started by reporting it. It also helps when we can collect forensic evidence that shows the engagement of this person, this victim, with individuals, and that's important as well. We can collect forensic evidence surrounding collateral evidence, videotape, things that will support a prosecution that is needed when we get the victim to a point where they are satisfied that they're comfortable, they're protected, and they're going to be, helped. And so collecting forensic evidence is important. Collecting collateral evidence such as videotapes of circumstances that are presented. All of these things can be coordinated in a prosecution. But it does start with us getting the support of that victim, and that victim can be supported by the programs that Ms. Martinez is describing. I'll let you take it from there.
Okay. How many of you young people in here have social media? Right? I mean, I do. Do you know every person on your social media? Have you met them face to face? Stop putting your business on social media. Let me just start by saying that. If you have not met that person face to face, you don't know who that is. Could it be a human trafficker? Maybe. Could it be just some creepy old dude? Or somebody trying to get in your business? Stop it. Okay? That's the best advice I can give you as far as social media. Don't put your business on social media, and everything on the internet is not true. Okay, next. Who in here has seen SVU, CSI, any of that stuff? Right? None of those things are real. None of that is true. I cannot pull DNA from you, stick it into a device, and it tells me who it is automatically. None of that is true. Okay? I can pull DNA from you immediately. If you know someone that is a victim, encourage them to report immediately. If they don't want to report to law enforcement, encourage them to still call us immediately. I can still do that exam. I still can collect DNA evidence. I can still do all of those things. And if that person decides 6 months from now they're willing to report, guess what? We still have your evidence and we're still there to help you to report. One of the most crucial things is reporting as soon as you see something. Reporting as soon as something happens. If y'all are at a kickback, that's what they're called, right? Off campus. If you're hanging out with your buddies or your friends and you see something that goes down, encourage them to call us immediately, okay? And then we can decide whether or not what to do later. I encourage everyone to report because, again, you can't hold your district attorney accountable saying, well, he didn't do anything if he doesn't know about it. If you don't report it, we don't know. But I do encourage you, while you're at your kickback, hanging out with your friends, having some drinks, stay together. Oh, yes, here.
You don't drink at Albany State.
Stay together. No one goes home alone. Whoever you're there with, that's who you leave with. And if something weird happens, intervene, keep your eyes and ears open, and encourage those people to report. DNA lives at the very longest 120 hours. At the very, very longest 120 hours. But that doesn't mean that it's likely. Immediately is best. And stay off social media and go home and delete everyone that you have not personally met face to face.
I wish we had more time. Really, there's a lot of things that both Ms. Martinez and I could share with you about how you can help identify circumstances. But, there may be things going on probably at sporting events, homecoming events. That's when people come down with things to entice you all to get involved in circumstances. We have drug dealers that come down to homecoming events. We have pimps that come down to homecoming events. You're walking around having a good homecoming event, but these persons are going to be here to exploit that. And these are the kind of things that are going on, and if you see this, you know, they bring girls in, and they bring drugs in, and everybody's having a good time at homecoming, but this is the kind of thing that where it's probably happening around you. And you need to be aware of that, and like I said, take note and report it to law enforcement so that we can begin, you know, addressing it if we can. So you're actually surrounded by it. So perhaps, like I said, at some future event, both Ms. Martinez and I can give you all some more direct pointers to look for as far as this type of activity that you can hopefully recognize and help law enforcement and victims by reporting it.
Thank you.